In the heart of a bustling city, where glass towers kissed the clouds and luxury cars roared down pristine avenues, lived a man named Edward Langston. He was the kind of figure that newspapers admired and employees feared. A self-made millionaire who had built his fortune in finance. His name carried weight in the boardroom, and his handshake could seal deals worth millions. To the world, Edward was the epitome of success, confident, commanding, and uncompromising. But behind the gleaming walls of his marble estate stood another story, one that few could see. His only son, Daniel Langston, walked through those halls with shoes worn thin, not from lack of money, but from endless wandering in search of himself. Daniel was nothing like his father. Where Edward was sharp, Daniel was reflective. Where Edward calculated every step, Daniel lingered on questions of purpose and meaning. Edward dressed in tailored suits. Daniel preferred shirts faded from too many washes. Edward saw the world as a chessboard, a game of strategy where only the strongest survived. Daniel, on the other hand, saw life as a canvas, one meant to be painted with passion, mistakes, and second chances. The contrast between father and son was striking, and in Edward's eyes, disappointing. Their home, a sprawling mansion on the edge of the city, reflected Edward's success: grand chandeliers, imported furniture, and a library filled with books he never had time to read. Yet within that grandeur, Daniel often felt like a guest rather than a son. Servants whispered about his lack of direction. Family friends gossiped that he was wasting the fortune he had been born into. Daniel had tried, of course. He studied at prestigious schools, attended the dinners his father arranged, and wore the suits that never felt like his own. But deep down, he longed for something Edward could not understand. A life not measured in wealth, but in worth. It was in the little things that the tension revealed itself. Daniel would spend hours sketching in the garden, his notebooks filled with ideas for community projects, small businesses that prioritized people over profit, and dreams that seemed too naive for the corporate world. Meanwhile, Edward would glance at those pages with disdain, asking, "When will you stop wasting time and start building something real?" The city outside mirrored their differences. On one side, towering skyscrapers where Edward reigned supreme. On the other, narrow alleys where Daniel often walked, speaking with vendors, listening to stories, and helping strangers with whatever little he had. To Edward, it was foolish charity. To Daniel, it was life. And so, the whispers grew louder. "The son of Edward Langston has no future," people said. Some mocked him, others pitied him. Even Daniel's friends, those who had once envied his privilege, began to distance themselves, chasing careers and status while he chased meaning. Still, Daniel carried himself with quiet dignity. He didn't fight back against the criticism, nor did he argue with his father's relentless pressure. Instead, he believed that time would reveal the truth, that one's value could not always be measured in money. But the storm was brewing. A single decision was about to fracture the fragile bond between father and son forever. Edward, tired of waiting, was ready to cut Daniel off, completely. No inheritance, no financial support, no safety net. In his mind, it was the only way to teach his son the harsh realities of the world. What Edward didn't know, however, was that this decision, born out of disappointment and pride, would one day become his greatest regret. For years later, when the tables had turned, the same father who had once looked down on his son would come to realize a truth far greater than wealth, that sometimes the one who loses everything gains the most. But how did Daniel survive when his lifeline was severed? What path did he take that even Edward, with all his fortune, could not foresee? And what twist of fate would force the rich father to admit who truly won? The answers lie in a journey that begins with rejection, unfolds through struggle, and ends with a lesson the world often forgets: that success is not always about the wealth you hold, but the life you build when the world turns its back on you. The decision came on a rainy evening, when thunder cracked against the city skyline and the Langston mansion stood lit like a fortress against the storm. Edward sat behind his mahogany desk, a glass of aged whiskey in hand, his eyes locked on the contracts sprawled before him. For him, business decisions were easy. Cold, calculated, but this one was different. This wasn't about a deal, it was about his son. Daniel entered the study, his hands still stained faintly with graphite from the sketches he'd been making in the garden. His clothes were simple, his expression calm but tired. "Father, we need to talk," he began softly. Edward didn't look up. "If it's about your little drawings again, save it. I don't have the patience tonight." "It's not just drawings," Daniel replied, his voice gaining strength. "I've been working on a project, a community workshop, a place where people can learn skills for free. Carpentry, tailoring, things that could change lives. I just need a small loan to get it started. Nothing compared to what you spend in a day." Finally, Edward raised his eyes, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Daniel, when will you stop chasing fantasies? You're 25. Other men your age are running companies, climbing ladders, making names for themselves. And you," he gestured dismissively at Daniel's worn shirt, "you're still playing the role of a dreamer." Daniel's face tightened, but he stood his ground. "Maybe I don't want to run companies. Maybe I want to build something that matters." Edward slammed his glass on the desk, the sound echoing through the room. "Something that matters? Do you think this family name was built on kindness and charity? No. It was built on power, on sacrifice, on never settling for less. And you," his voice rose, thunder matching his anger outside, "you have the privilege to continue that legacy, but you throw it away for the poor and the ungrateful." The words cut deep. Daniel's chest burned, not from anger alone, but from years of being dismissed, belittled, unseen. "So people don't matter to you?" he asked quietly. "Only money does?" For a moment, silence. Then Edward leaned back, cold and unyielding. "Yes, because money is what keeps people alive. Without it, you are nothing." The line was drawn. That night, Edward called the family accountant. "From this day forward," he commanded, "Daniel will receive no more support, no allowance, no inheritance, not a single cent. If he wants to survive, let him do it on his own. Maybe then he'll understand the world." Word spread quickly. Within days, Daniel's world collapsed. His credit cards were frozen, his accounts emptied, his name erased from the family's financial empire. The mansion staff looked at him differently now, their pity turning to judgment. Some even whispered behind his back. The son of Edward Langston, cut off like a beggar. One evening, Daniel overheard two servants speaking in the hallway. "He won't last a month out there," one said with a smirk. "Maybe that's the point," the other replied. "The master wants to teach him a lesson." Daniel felt the sting of humiliation, but he said nothing. He packed his few belongings into an old duffel bag, his hands trembling not from fear of poverty, but from the betrayal of his own father. On his last night in the mansion, he confronted Edward one final time. "You're really doing this?" Daniel asked, his voice raw. Edward stood by the fireplace, arms crossed. "I am. You need to learn." "Learn what? That love has a price tag? That a father only values a son if he makes money?" Edward's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes, though he tried to hide them. "One day, father, you'll see that wealth isn't the only way to measure a man. And when that day comes, it won't be me who loses. It will be you." Edward turned away, refusing to look at him. "Get out." And so Daniel walked into the night. The storm still raged, soaking him to the bone, but in his heart burned a fire stronger than the rain. The days that followed were merciless. Without money, Daniel was mocked by those who once envied him. Friends who had filled his phone with invitations suddenly stopped calling. Former classmates laughed when they heard he was working odd jobs. Even the local bank, ironically one his father had major shares in, turned him away when he asked for a small loan. "You? A Langston?" the clerk sneered. "Your father already warned us about you. Said you're on your own now." It was as though Edward had erased him not just from the family, but from the entire city. At night, Daniel lay awake in a cramped apartment he could barely afford, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering if he had made a mistake. Doubt gnawed at him. Maybe his father was right. Maybe dreams couldn't feed a man. Maybe kindness really was weakness. Yet every morning as the sun rose, Daniel remembered the faces of the people he wanted to help. The street vendor who worked from dawn to dusk, the child selling newspapers with bare feet, the widowed woman who carried groceries for strangers just to earn a coin. And it was in those faces that he found his strength. Still, the pain of rejection lingered. The wound of being cast aside by his own father festered in his heart. Anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. Not anger at losing money, but at losing trust, losing family. The world had turned its back on him, and now Daniel had to decide. Would he surrender to the weight of his father's judgment, or would he rise? Proof not only to Edward but to the world that a man's worth could never be cut off by money. The conflict had begun. The first weeks outside the Langston estate were like stepping into another world. Gone were the marble floors, the polished banisters, the quiet hum of wealth. Daniel now walked cracked sidewalks where neon lights flickered and the smell of cheap food mixed with exhaust fumes. His new home was a single room above a laundromat, its walls stained with years of steam and neglect. The once privileged heir was now just another face in the crowd. But Daniel refused to surrender. Every morning he woke before dawn, his mind racing with ideas. He worked odd jobs, stacking shelves at a corner store, cleaning tables at a diner, carrying boxes at the docks. The wages were barely enough to survive, but they bought him something more valuable than comfort: independence. Still, the world had its cruel ways of reminding him who he was, or rather, who he used to be. At the diner, a customer sneered when he recognized him. "A Langston? Wiping tables now? Guess Daddy finally got tired of your laziness." Laughter followed, and Daniel forced a smile, though inside, shame burned like fire. That night, he returned to his tiny room and opened his sketchbook. His pencil scratched furiously across the page, drawing plans for the community workshop he had once dreamed of. A place where people could learn, where no one would be mocked for starting small. He whispered to himself, "This isn't the end, it's only the beginning." But dreams are fragile things when hunger knocks at the door. One evening, his childhood friend Marcus arrived at the diner. Marcus had taken the opposite path, suit pressed, watch gleaming, already climbing the corporate ladder. "Daniel," Marcus said, shaking his head as if disappointed. "You're wasting your time. Forget these childish ideas. Come work with me at Hartwell & Co. It's not glamorous, but you'll earn, and that's all that matters." Daniel sighed. "Money isn't enough, Marcus. I need to build something meaningful." Marcus leaned closer, his voice low. "Meaning doesn't pay rent. Don't be a fool." Then he tossed a bill on the counter, more than enough to cover his meal, and walked out without looking back. That conversation echoed in Daniel's mind for weeks. At times, Marcus's words gnawed at him. Maybe he was a fool. Maybe his father and his friend were right. Yet every time he doubted, life offered him reminders. One night on his way home, Daniel saw a boy barely 12 trying to fix a broken bicycle under a street lamp. The boy's hands were greasy, his tools scattered. Daniel knelt beside him. "Need help?" The boy looked up warily. "I don't have money to pay you." Daniel smiled. "I didn't ask for money. Let's do it together." Within an hour, the bike was fixed, and the boy's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. No one ever stops to help." Daniel walked away with a strange warmth in his chest. That moment, though small, reminded him why he endured the ridicule and the struggle. He wasn't chasing profit, he was chasing purpose. Yet the obstacles kept coming. When he finally gathered enough savings to rent a small garage as the first step toward his workshop, the landlord eyed him with suspicion. "You sure you can pay? I know who you are, Langston. Word is your father cut you off. I don't want trouble." Daniel clenched his fists but kept calm. "I can pay. Every month. I don't need my father's name." The landlord smirked. "We'll see." But even as he set up old benches and borrowed tools, new problems surfaced. The neighborhood kids mocked the shabby garage. Some adults laughed openly. "Who'd want to learn here?" they jeered. "Looks more like a junkyard than a school." Daniel felt the sting, but he refused to quit. Slowly, he attracted a few curious souls: an unemployed carpenter, a widowed seamstress, a teenager desperate for direction. They came not because the place was beautiful, but because Daniel welcomed them with dignity. Still, the challenges grew heavier. Tools broke. Rent climbed. His savings dwindled. And late at night, when exhaustion gnawed at his bones, doubt whispered again. "What if I fail? What if my father was right all along?" One evening, sitting alone in the garage lit only by a single bulb, Daniel buried his face in his hands. "Maybe I can't do this," he muttered. Then the door creaked open. It was the boy with the bicycle, now riding confidently. He stepped inside and said, "I told my friends about you. They want to learn too. Please don't give up." Daniel lifted his head, tears blurring his vision. That small voice pierced the fog of doubt. The rising tension was undeniable. For every step forward, another wall rose before him. His father's shadow loomed over everything. Businessmen refused to partner with him out of fear of Edward's influence. Banks denied him loans. Even his own relatives mocked him at gatherings, saying, "Daniel's building castles in the air." But inside, a storm brewed. The rejection, the ridicule, the betrayal, it all fueled him. Each failure became fuel for his determination. Each insult hardened his resolve. Daniel began to see clearly. The path he had chosen was not meant to be easy. It was meant to break him. Or prove him. And so, with trembling hands but unshaken spirit, he whispered to himself beneath that flickering bulb, "They think I'll collapse without money, but they have no idea how strong a man becomes when he has nothing left to lose." The rising action was set. The struggle had carved him, tested him, pushed him to the edge, and it was only a matter of time before everything, his efforts, his pain, his purpose, would collide in a climax neither he nor his father could foresee. Years passed. The city changed, but one thing did not: Edward Langston's empire. His company still dominated the skyline, his name still opened doors. Yet beneath the glittering surface, cracks had begun to show. A risky investment, a shifting market, whispers of betrayal within his boardroom. Edward was fighting battles he never imagined. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, something remarkable was happening. Daniel's little garage had grown. What began with a handful of learners had become a thriving hub of hope. The community workshop had expanded into multiple centers. Hundreds of people, once overlooked by society, were now earning livelihoods, building small businesses, and supporting their families. Daniel's name carried no corporate weight, but in the streets it carried something greater: respect. The paths of father and son were about to collide in the most unexpected way. It happened on a gray afternoon inside the boardroom of Langston Enterprises. Edward faced a table of grim executives. "Sir," one of them said, "our investors are pulling out. The factory closures in the East have crippled us. Unless we secure new partnerships, the company could face bankruptcy within months." Edward clenched his fists. Impossible. Langston Enterprises does not fail. But the truth was undeniable. His empire, built on money and power, was crumbling. And then came the cruelest twist. Several of the city's rising entrepreneurs, the very ones now dominating markets, had been trained in Daniel's workshops. They had formed a coalition, an alternative network that thrived where Edward's old system collapsed. For the first time in his life, Edward realized he might need help. And the irony struck like lightning. The only person with the influence and trust of these new entrepreneurs was his son. That evening, Edward swallowed his pride and went to find Daniel. He arrived at a newly built community center, larger and livelier than anything he had imagined. The walls buzzed with energy, young men and women learning trades, families gathering, children laughing. It was alive in a way his corporate towers had never been. Edward walked through the doors, and the room quieted. Whispers spread quickly. "That's Edward Langston, the tycoon who cut off his own son." Then Daniel appeared. He was no longer the timid young man with worn shoes. His presence was calm yet commanding, his clothes simple but dignified. Time and struggle had carved resilience into his face. "Father," Daniel said, his voice steady, "I didn't expect to see you here." Edward hesitated. The words caught in his throat, but desperation pushed them out. "Daniel, I need your help." Gasps echoed through the room, the mighty Edward Langston bowing his head to the son he had cast aside. Daniel's eyes searched his father's face, reading the exhaustion, the cracks in his armor. "Help?" he repeated softly. "All those years you told me money was everything. You said without it, I was nothing. Now you come here, asking me?" Edward's voice trembled. "I was wrong. The world has changed, and I cannot face it alone. These people, your people, they listen to you. They trust you. Without your support, I may lose everything." A heavy silence hung in the air. Daniel's mind raced with memories. The night he was cut off, the whispers of mockery, the nights of hunger, the doubts that haunted him. Part of him wanted to turn away, to let his father taste the bitterness of rejection. But then he looked around the room. At the boy whose bike he had once fixed, now teaching others. At the widow who had started her own tailoring business. At the faces of hundreds who had believed in him when no one else did. Daniel realized this was not just about revenge. It was about proving that wealth was not the ultimate power. Hope was. He took a deep breath. "You taught me money is what keeps people alive," Daniel said. "But look around you, Father. These people are alive not because of money, but because of belief. Because someone gave them a chance when no one else would. That's what you never understood." Edward's eyes glistened, though he tried to hide it. For the first time, he felt the sting of shame, not from failure, but from realizing how blind he had been. "Daniel, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I beg you, don't let me lose everything." Daniel stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "You already lost, Father. Not your money, not your company. Those can be rebuilt. You lost the chance to stand beside me when it mattered most. And that, no amount of wealth can buy back." The words struck Edward like thunder. The man who had once ruled boardrooms stood trembling before his son, stripped of power, stripped of pride. And then came the final twist. Daniel extended his hand, not out of weakness, but out of strength. "I will help, not for you, but for the people whose lives depend on it. But understand this, Father, I am no longer your shadow. I am my own man, and this time, we do it my way." Edward stared at the hand, his own trembling as he reached out. The room held its breath. In that handshake, power shifted forever. The climax had arrived. The father who once believed his son was nothing had now bowed to the truth. The real wealth was not in the empire he built, but in the legacy his son had created without him. The deal was struck, but not in the way Edward had imagined. This time, Daniel stood at the head of the table, not as a subordinate, but as an equal, perhaps even more than that. The once rejected son was now the man whose voice could sway the very people Edward needed most. And though Daniel agreed to help, he did it on his terms. He ensured that the partnerships were fair, that workers were treated with dignity, and that the wealth created was shared more equitably. Slowly, Langston Enterprises began to recover, not through the old ruthless methods of its founder, but through the principles of compassion and purpose as Daniel had lived by all along. Edward, once a figure of towering pride, found himself humbled. Each board meeting became a lesson, each handshake a reminder of the son he had underestimated. Where Edward once saw weakness in kindness, he now saw strength. Where he once mocked Daniel's ideals, he now recognized them as the foundation of survival in a changing world. One evening, long after the recovery had begun, Edward sat quietly in the community center Daniel had built. He watched children laughing as they painted, women learning new trades, young men discussing business ideas. He turned to his son, sitting beside him, and whispered, "I thought I was teaching you what mattered, but all along, it was you teaching me." Daniel looked at him, his eyes calm. "It was never about proving you wrong, Father. It was about proving that people, no matter how poor, no matter how small, deserve a chance to rise. That's a lesson no fortune can buy." In that moment, Edward felt something shift inside him. For the first time in decades, he didn't see success in skyscrapers or stock prices. He saw it in the glow of hope on people's faces, in the resilience of a son who had endured rejection and still chosen forgiveness. The city, too, began to whisper a different story. No longer was Daniel Langston the lost heir mocked for his failures. He was now spoken of with admiration. The man who built without wealth. The son who rose without inheritance. He became a symbol that strength was not found in privilege, but in perseverance. Even Edward's harshest critics saw the change in him. The once proud tycoon now walked humbly beside his son, not leading, but learning. He attended community events, listened to the stories of people he once ignored, and little by little, allowed his hardened heart to soften. Daniel's journey was not one of revenge, but of redemption, for both himself and his father. And so the conflict found its resolution not in victory or defeat, but in transformation. Edward realized too late that cutting off his son had never diminished Daniel. It had freed him. In losing the crutch of inherited wealth, Daniel had discovered his true strength. The lesson was undeniable. Sometimes the greatest gift life can give is the chance to struggle. Because in the fire of struggle, character is forged. I leave you with this truth. Wealth can build empires, but it cannot build a soul. Power can command respect, but it cannot earn love. And when the money fades and the titles crumble, what remains is the legacy of how we chose to live, how we treated others, and whether we dared to stand for something greater than ourselves. Edward once believed his son was nothing without money. But in the end, it was Daniel who showed the world, and his father, that true wealth is not measured in fortunes gained, but in lives touched. And that is why, when history remembers the Langston name, it will not be for the empire that rose and fell in glass towers, but for the son who taught us all that kindness is strength and purpose is victory.